Hunger, pain, uncertainty, and fear. A lot of fear. This is how the inhabitants of Stalag Luft III, a Nazi prisoner of war camp in occupied Poland, spent their days. There, more than 10,000 officers of the Allied air forces knew true suffering. To escape the torment they had to face within those four walls, these high-ranking soldiers used their training to plan constant escape attempts. The hope of regaining their freedom was the driving force that drove them to think of the most extreme ideas to escape. In this new military history video, we will learn what life was like for Allied prisoners under the brutal Nazi regime and discover all the details behind the fearsome Stalag Luft III. Stay with us as we go through this bleak and bloody chapter of World War II. Here we go.
They brought them back in urns and let us bury them there. And we had a little cemetery outside the wire where they buried them. Had a formal ceremony. I have no qualms about Stalag Luft III, except the 50 guys they shot. That set me back.
Throughout the savage conflict that left millions dead, prisoner of war camps were no exception to German cruelty. While the 1929 Geneva Convention sought to protect soldiers captured in war, their application was uneven, and many troops were subjected to inhumane conditions. This was especially true in the final years of the war, when resources were scarce and Nazi authorities grew desperate. Generally speaking, Allies who ended up in enemy hands, especially British, American, and French prisoners, were better cared for than prisoners from the Eastern Front, such as the Soviets. The latter were subject to brutal and merciless treatment due to the ideological nature of the Third Reich and its particular hatred of communism. However, Western forces also suffered from the fierce and violent punishments of Adolf Hitler's men. They often faced beatings, forced labor, extreme hunger, and solitary confinement. As the war progressed and the situation in Germany worsened, conditions in the camps also deteriorated rapidly. Food rations became minimal, leading many prisoners to suffer from severe malnutrition. Inmates were used as slave labor in factories, mines, and farms, working grueling hours under extremely dangerous circumstances. Those who managed to survive suffered from profound physical and psychological exhaustion. Day-to-day life in the camps was monotonous, repetitive, and distressing. Trapped soldiers would rise early, line up for roll call, and then begin their assigned duties. While the strain was enormous, food portions did not exceed 1,000 calories, far below what the human body needs to cope with great efforts. Many prisoners relied on extra food packages provided by the Red Cross, although towards the end of the war, these became less frequent as a result of blockades and the transport situation.
The German rations deteriorated as the war went on, because, of course, the German food got worse. If it hadn't have been for the Red Cross parcels that came through, I doubt if many of us would be alive now.
This was not the only problem they had to face. The climate, especially during the winter, made the conditions even worse. In the coldest months, many prisoners suffered from hypothermia, respiratory illnesses, and other ailments due to the lack of shelter and adequate heating. Medical treatment was practically non-existent. The fate of the victims was decided between life and death, with the same chance as a two-sided coin spinning in the air. Often, it was not hunger or disease that killed the prisoners. Only the smallest act of disobedience was necessary to find themselves with a bloody execution that was intended to terrorize the other soldiers in captivity. This was the cruel way of maintaining control over the huge populations that lived crowded together in the fearsome camps. These examples allow us to understand that the general rule within these detention centers was physical and psychological suffering, accompanied by uncertainty and the constant struggle for survival. In 1940, the Germans built a series of camps to hold all the enemy captured during the rapid rise of the Third Reich in Europe. One of them was Stalag Luft III, a very particular space with its own rules, and which was the scene of great tragedies during the Second World War.
Located generally in forest clearings, these camps were cheap and easy to construct. Their layout was very bare, and with regularly spaced sentry towers, proved much easier to watch over. Conditions for the prisoners improved because they now had more living space. There was room to exercise properly and stage large sporting events. Their diet was also improved because now they had room to cultivate their own vegetable patches.
Stalag Luft III stood in Zagan, deep within occupied Poland. It was hidden behind enemy lines, miles from any hope of rescue. The steel wire fences surrounding the camp seemed to glow with a cold malevolence, a constant reminder that every step beyond the boundaries meant death. This space was not for just anyone. Officers of the Allied aviation, especially the Royal Air Force and the American USAF, were taken there. These heroes of the vast sky now walked on solid ground, the weight of defeat hanging on their shoulders. Each of them had felt the freedom of flight, but their combat days were over, and the incredible maneuvers through the air were replaced by the monotonous work in a Nazi prison camp. It was not only the routine that oppressed them, but the permanent anguish of being trapped in a place designed to slowly destroy their spirits. However, unlike the concentration and extermination camps that were run by the Gestapo and SS, this site was controlled by guards from the Luftwaffe, the Nazi Air Force. These men watched with relentless attention, were always on the alert and distrustful of captured men. They knew that while the camp was their prison, the inmates within were not submissive. An implicit code between enemy airmen made the Germans respect their captives, but the war had corrupted all that. Any attempt to escape would be treated with the most ruthless of reprisals.
The Gestapo, in fact, had tried to gain influence over prisoner of war camps as early as 1941, just after the commencement of the Russian campaign, when they rounded up thousands and thousands of Russian prisoners. And they passed an edict which laid it down that insubordination, active or passive resistance, must be immediately broken by force of arms. Prisoners who try to escape must be shot immediately without being challenged.
Life in the camp was a constant dance between desperation and routine. With the cold penetrating to their bones, the prisoners were awakened each day by the cry of the guards, checking that no one had disappeared during the night. Although the Luftwaffe maintained certain standards of decent treatment for the captives, food rations were meager, barely enough to keep them alive. Black bread, watery broth, and the occasional Red Cross package were their only sources of energy. However, it was not all suffering. There was a peculiar courtesy on the part of the Nazis, which allowed different types of activities to be carried out. One of these was the creation of a vegetable garden, something that offered a respite from the ever-present hunger. However, the hostile climate and the rough soil did not encourage development that could cope with a camp overcrowded with thousands of captured combatants. Another alternative that was presented was that of theater. Many people joined the initiative, trying to cling to some fragment of normality, anything to distract them from the relentless passage of time in hell. Thus, a kind of artistic workshop was improvised, in which plays starring the prisoners were rehearsed and eventually performed. In the harshest winters, some men recited Shakespeare, while others organized football matches or chess tournaments. Sport had also become an escape from reality.
It was very disciplined. When you see films, people assume that it was like a Boy Scout camp.
But despite the relatively comfortable conditions, Stalag Luft III is nothing more than a prison.
But behind every smile or shared joke, there was a latent mission: escape. Every small act, every exchange of information, every seemingly harmless conversation about the weather or art actually belonged to a piece of the great puzzle that was taking shape. Officers worked together on forged documents to escape, sewed uniforms, and built homemade compasses. Red Cross packages, which brought cigarettes and essential items, became a vital currency to bribe guards or exchange materials inside the camp. Within the Allies, a flame still burned that was impossible to extinguish, an indomitable fire that neither defeat nor captivity could extinguish. Resistance would be a big part of the history of Stalag Luft III, and soon the silent will of these men would turn into a powerful cry of struggle. They knew the risks, the high price they would have to pay if they were caught, but that did not matter to them. They were determined to get their lives back. Otherwise, it was not worth continuing in this world.
The greatest enemy of prisoners is boredom. When boredom comes, morale declines, and soon you have mutiny, lack of discipline, and people who will no longer take an interest in their life.
The camp was divided into different sectors, like small villages of misery and resistance. The barracks were austere, long wooden buildings that creaked with every step and whose dirty windows let in little light and even less hope. The beds, stacked 3 high, were made of wooden planks as rough as the treatment they received. There was no privacy, only the endless sound of men breathing, dreaming of their freedom. These spaces that had become their prison were built on brick towers in order to prevent the inmates from digging tunnels. In that case, the guards would easily see them. And as an extra security system, seismographs had been installed, a tool that would alert the Nazis if movement was detected in the earth. The ground beneath the surface was their greatest ally. The loose yellow earth of the deeper layers shone like a warning under the prisoners' feet. Any intention to create an underground path would be immediately exposed if that light sand surfaced. Still, every prisoner arrived at Stalag Luft III with one certainty: escape was not an option, but a duty. The Germans knew this, and so every detail of the camp had been designed with a meticulous intention to thwart any escape attempt. The plan to escape had to consider every detail to the maximum. Still, the chances of success were minimal. But these men were not just pilots. They were architects of their own freedom. They knew that every day in captivity brought them closer to madness, to psychological surrender. So, as the Polish winter advanced, foreshadowing a silent death, the prisoners were not simply thinking about their escape, but creating a parallel world underground.
Caught in the middle of this, one of the final battlefields of World War II, are 10,000 Allied Air Force officers. They are prisoners of war. And they are about to face a journey that will challenge their very determination to survive.
Secretly, the men began to dig 3 tunnels, which they named after Tom, Dick, and Harry. Each of these underground paths was a direct blow to oppression, a symbol of the battle between human will and the walls that surrounded them. To prevent the Germans from suspecting that a mass escape was being organized, the prisoners devised various escape plans. Some were individual, and others formed by small groups to mislead. While they were digging the tunnel called Tom, the Allies realized that the distance between the barracks and the forest was too great. This could make them visible to the guards, so they decided to continue drilling near the wire fence and shorten the meters they would have to cover. To do this, and to conceal themselves from the German guards, they made a large gym box that was hollow inside. Inside, they hid 3 of the prisoners who were going to escape, so that each day they would spend a few meters extending the escape route to freedom. Meanwhile, the rest of their companions did exercises around them to continue with the deception. Surprisingly, the system worked, and 3 prisoners managed to escape from the camp and reach Great Britain without further setbacks. However, despite all the precautions taken, the tunnel was discovered, and it was decided to abandon the construction of the Tom and Dick passages and focus only on digging the last of the exits, Harry. This was the route for the mass escape, which would take place on Friday, March 24th, 1944. This choice was not made at random. The men wanted to take advantage of the fact that on that day the train stopping at the nearby Zagen station would be full of soldiers and foreign workers, so they could blend in with the crowd and escape more easily. Everything was ready, and the dangerous plan was set in motion. An eerie silence hung over the camp as 76 prisoners, one by one, crawled through the tunnel toward a freedom they could almost taste. The path was a miracle of clandestine engineering, more than 10 meters underground, reinforced with wood stolen from the barracks and furniture. It extended to a small clearing beyond the barbed wire. But what the men did not know was that the exit was too close to the guards' line. Hope was gone in an instant. With the first rays of light that accompanied the dawn, the Germans discovered
76 Allied officers escape before guards stumble onto the tunnel. Alarms sound, the manhunt begins. and the Nazis know that there are men still in the camp who assisted with the plan.
They took us out of the hut and lined us all up, and they had machine guns all around, and they were screaming and yelling in German, and I really thought, maybe we were going to get shot there. That was the only time I was really scared.
Hundreds of Nazi soldiers began hunting down the fugitives. The escape gradually became a failure. The prisoners became prey to Nazi brutality at its finest. They were killed while trying to board a train or a bus that would take them out of that hell. One of them fell for an old trick used by Gestapo agents. When he tried to board one of the means of transport, a Nazi officer said goodbye to him, wishing him good luck in English, and the soldier, without realizing it, spontaneously responded in the same language, unmasking his true identity. Most of the men were recaptured within a few days. Only 3 managed to escape for good. The rest who had survived the German hunt were sent back to the camp. Once in Stalag Luft III, a total of 50 Allied soldiers were executed on the direct order of Adolf Hitler. That was their punishment for trying to escape, and the message to all prisoners who had the same plan. That act of retaliation shocked the world, but after the discovery of the rest of the atrocities committed by the Nazis, it was simply one more event that was added to a long list of terrible crimes. The final fate of the camp is a separate story. In early 1945, the advance of the Soviet Army and other units liberating prisoners caused the German High Command to decide to move the inmates to another location.
January 28th. We finally left camp at 4 a.m. I was outside the wire for the first time in 20 months.
The Germans had made absolutely no preparation for this forced march. There was no direction, there was no ultimate goal, no food, no water, no housing. They simply had chosen to keep the prisoners under their control.
The lack of organization of the Third Reich in full collapse was a failure equal to or greater than the escape attempt. Several of the prisoners died from having to face the worst European winter in 50 years, in deplorable conditions. Meanwhile, those who reached their destination would finally be released after the fall of Nazi Germany in April. Now, after having learned more about life and the most incredible events in this particular prisoner camp, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in our next military history video.